At exactly 10 p.m., while I was working overtime, alone, my neighbor called. "Don't go home tonight. Don't ask questions." I demanded an explanation. After a long silence, he said, "By morning, you'll be thanking me." Then he hung up. I barely slept. At 6 a.m., the TV in the break room switched to the morning news. The moment I saw what was on the screen, every drop of blood in my body turned cold because the nightmare had already begun. It means everything that you chose to spend your time here. Quick question, before we begin, what city or country are you joining from today? Let me know in the comments. Heads up, some elements of this story are fictional, created to serve the narrative and its deeper lesson. Any resemblance to existing names or locations is entirely coincidental, but what this story has to say, I believe you'll find worthwhile. If someone had told me that Wednesday evening that I wouldn't sleep in my own bed for weeks, I would have laughed. I probably would have offered them a cup of coffee and suggested they get some rest themselves, but that was before the phone rang. It was exactly 10 o'clock on the night of Wednesday, November the 12th, 2025. I know the time because I had just looked up from the stack of invoices on my desk to check the clock on the wall, an old thing battery-powered, the kind that ticks loud enough to hear across a quiet room. The offices of Pacific Rim Logistics on East Marginal Way South were empty, except for me, Frank Stiles. My manager, a broad-shouldered man in his mid-50s who wore the same brand of flannel shirt every single day, had locked up his own office and said goodnight around 9. The building settled into that particular silence that only exists in industrial neighborhoods. After dark, the distant hum of the port, the occasional rumble of a truck on the highway, and nothing else. I had been doing this for 14 months, taking the night shift 8 in the evening until 2 in the morning, auditing freight manifests and reconciling shipping accounts for a company that moved cargo containers between Seattle, Tacoma, and Portland. It was not glamorous work. It was not even work I needed financially. But it was work that kept my hands busy and my mind occupied during the hours when the house on SW 152nd Street in Burien felt too large and too quiet for one person. Helen had been gone 14 months, my wife of 31 years, and the silence she left behind was a different kind of silence entirely. I reached into my shirt pocket and touched the edge of the small photograph I kept there. Helen and me at Pike Place Market, summer of 2024, 3 months before the diagnosis that changed everything. She was laughing at something I had said, her head tilted back, one hand raised as if to wave away my joke. I had looked at that photograph so many times that the edges had gone soft. I put it back and returned to the invoices. Then my phone rang. The screen lit up with a name I had not expected: Marcus Holt. Marcus was my neighbor on the east side, a 65-year-old man who kept to himself, walked his old Labrador retriever named Rex every morning at 6:30, and exchanged no more than a dozen words with me in any given week. He was the kind of neighbor you appreciated precisely because he never asked for anything and never offered more than a nod over the fence. In 14 months of living next door to each other as widowed and retired men, he had never once called me on the phone. I picked up. "Marcus," his voice came through low and pressed tight like a man speaking through a door he was afraid to open too wide. "Arthur, tonight don't go home. Don't ask me why, just stay where you are until morning." My hand tightened around the phone. "What are you talking about? What's going on?" "I can't explain right now." A pause. I could hear him breathing, controlled and deliberate. "By morning you'll be thanking me. Just don't go home." "Marcus, you can't call me at 10 o'clock at night and tell me not to go home without giving me a reason. Is there a gas leak? A fire? What?" The line went dead. I pulled the phone from my ear and stared at it. The clock on the wall ticked. I called him back. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I called again. Same result. A third time, nothing. I set the phone down on the desk and stood up, pressing both hands flat on the surface, trying to think through it logically, the way I had always approached problems. Marcus was not a dramatic man. He was not the kind of person who made things up or reached out without reason. In 14 months, he had never once knocked on my door uninvited. And now he had called me at 10 in the evening with a voice that made my chest tighten in a way I could not entirely explain. I called Frank Stiles. He picked up on the third ring, his voice thick with the beginning of sleep. Frank, sorry to bother you. Has anything happened around the Burien neighborhood tonight? Anything on the news? Anything you heard?" Frank cleared his throat. "Burien. No, nothing. Everything okay, Arthur?" "Fine. Just a neighbor called. Probably nothing." Sorry to wake you. Don't worry about it. Lock up tight before you leave." I hung up and walked to the window that faced the parking lot. The asphalt was dark and wet, the overhead lights casting yellow pools across the empty spaces. My car sat alone near the entrance, a navy blue Honda, reliable and unremarkable, the same car Helen had encouraged me to keep when I wanted to trade it in last year. I stood there for a long time, my breath fogging slightly against the cold glass. Every reasonable part of my mind told me Marcus had made a mistake, wrong number, confused moment. The kind of thing that happened to men our age more often than we like to admit. There was no reason to take it seriously. But there was something in his voice, not fear exactly, something more controlled than fear, something that sounded like a man who knew exactly what he was saying and exactly why he couldn't say more. I went to the storage closet at the back of the office and pulled out the thin blanket Frank kept there for the rare occasions he worked late into the night. I turned off the overhead light, left the small desk lamp burning, and lay down on the narrow couch against the wall. I told myself I would rest for a few hours and reassess in the morning. I told myself it was nothing. I had almost convinced myself of both things when the phone on the coffee table buzzed once, a text message, not a call. I reached for it without sitting up, squinting at the brightness of the screen. The number was not saved in my contacts. The message was 4 words long. "Smart move, Mr. Vance. Stay where you are." I sat upright so fast my back protested. My heart hammered against my ribs. I read the message again and again. The words did not change. Someone knew my name. Someone knew I had stayed. Someone right now at 10 minutes past 10 on a Wednesday night was watching. An hour had passed since I put the phone down, maybe more. The desk lamp threw a small circle of yellow light across the carpet, and everything beyond it had dissolved into shadow. I had not moved from the couch. The blanket was still folded across my legs untouched. The text message was still on my screen, the brightness dimmed now, but the words unchanged when I tapped it awake for what had to be the 8th or 9th time. "Smart move, Mr. Vance. Stay where you are." I had typed 3 different replies and deleted all 3. What do you say to a message like that? "Who are you" felt naive. "What do you want" felt like an invitation. And "I'm calling the police" felt hollow when I had nothing to show them except a warning from a neighbor who wouldn't explain himself, and 4 words from a number that almost certainly didn't exist anymore. So I sat with it. That was what I had learned to do in the 14 months since Helen died, sit with the things I couldn't fix and wait for morning to make them smaller. It didn't always work. It wasn't working now. I reached into my shirt pocket and took out the photograph. In the dim light from the desk lamp, I could barely make out the details, her face, the market stalls behind her, the way her left hand was raised mid-laugh. I had taken that photo on a Tuesday in July, 2024. We had gone to Pike Place for Dungeness crab and ended up spending 3 hours just walking. Helen had stopped at every flower stall. She always stopped at every flower stall. 3 months after that photo, she sat me down at the kitchen table and told me what the doctor had said. I pressed the photograph between both palms and closed my eyes. It was then that the first memory surfaced, the one I had been pushing down since Marcus's call. It was a Sunday afternoon in August, the summer before Helen got sick. She had been sitting in the old wooden chair on the back porch, a wide-armed thing she had found at an estate sale in Renton, and refinished herself, painting it a deep forest green. She was holding a mug of tea with both hands and staring out at the yard the way she sometimes did when something was working itself out behind her eyes. I had come outside with my own coffee and sat on the steps beside her. "Promise me something, Arthur," she said without looking at me. I remember the way the late afternoon light came through the cedar trees at the back of the yard. I remember thinking it was a beautiful evening and that I was lucky. "What's that?" I said. "Whatever happens." She paused, wrapped her fingers tighter around the mug. "Don't sign anything over to Julian. Not the house, not the savings, not yet." I turned to look at her. "Helen, where is this coming from?" She finally looked at me then, and there was something in her expression I couldn't name, not worry exactly, not sadness. Something older than both of those things. "Just promise me," she said quietly. "All right," I said, because I trusted her the way you trust someone after 30 years. "I promise." She nodded once and turned back to the yard. She never explained it. I never pushed. I told myself it was the kind of thing people said when they were getting older, cautious thoughts about the future, about what happens when you're gone. I filed it away and forgot it. Until now. I opened my eyes and stared at the ceiling of the dark office. The second memory came without warning, the way the uncomfortable ones always do. Julian had visited in June, 8 months before the night I was lying on this couch. He had driven up from Portland in a rented car, a black Mercedes, the kind that costs more per day than most people spend on groceries in a week. He was wearing a charcoal suit even on a Sunday, his dark hair cut, close his smile arriving slightly ahead of the rest of his expression, the way it always did. He had brought an expensive bottle of Napa Valley Cabernet and set it on the kitchen counter without asking if I wanted it opened. "Dad," he said, settling into the chair across from me at the kitchen table, "I've been thinking about the house." His voice was warm. It was always warm. Julian had learned somewhere along the way that warmth was a tool, and he had become expert at deploying it. "The house is fine," I said. "I know it's fine. I just think with everything that's happened with Mom gone, it might be worth thinking about simplifying things. The property, the savings account. You shouldn't have to manage all of that alone." "I'm not alone," I told him. "I have an accountant." He laughed that easy practiced laugh. "Of course, I just meant—" "I know what you meant, Julian." He looked at me for a moment, and something shifted behind his eyes. Not much, just enough for me to catch it before his smile reset. "We'll talk about it another time," he said, and reached for the wine bottle. No rush. Helen had been right about something. I had felt it that afternoon and had not let myself think about what it was. Now, lying in the dark of an empty office building at 11 o'clock at night, with a stranger's message glowing on my phone and my neighbor's warning still ringing in my ears, I felt it again. I pressed my thumb against the photograph until the edge bent slightly. "What did you see, Helen?" I whispered to the empty room. "What did you see that I couldn't—" The desk lamp hummed. The port rumbled in the distance. No answer came. I was still staring at the ceiling when my phone buzzed again, not once but 6 times in rapid succession. I grabbed it fast, my heart lurching into my throat. 6 missed calls, 3 different numbers, none of them saved, all in the last 12 minutes while I had been lying here, lost in memory. And then underneath the missed call notifications, a new message from Marcus. "Don't turn on the news tomorrow morning." My mouth went dry. I read it twice, 3 times. The words did not change. I sat there on that narrow couch in the dark, the photograph still bent slightly in my hand, staring at those 8 words and feeling the floor shift beneath me in a way that had nothing to do with the building. Something had already happened. Whatever it was, it had already happened. Marcus knew, and whoever had sent that first message knew too. I just didn't know yet. What I am about to tell you, I did not witness. I want to be clear about that from the start. I learned what happened at the house on ESW 152nd Street that night in pieces from Agent Cole Whitfield of the FBI Seattle field office, who walked me through the forensic timeline 3 weeks later in a conference room that smelled of burned coffee. From Tommy Rusk, a 27-year-old IT technician who had worked for Julian's company and who sat across from me in that same room with his hands wrapped around a paper cup, unable to look me in the eye while he talked. From photographs, from thermal imaging reports, from a fragment of security footage that survived on a neighbor's camera 2 streets over. I am going to tell you now, because you need to understand what was happening 3 miles west of that office couch, while I was lying there reading Marcus's message over and over in the dark. Julian arrived at 11:38 p.m. Not in his own car. He had flown into SeaTac 2 days earlier, under a different travel itinerary, one his assistant had booked through a shell company, and had rented a vehicle using a secondary credit card that took Agent Whitfield's team 6 weeks to trace. The car was a dark gray Ford Escape Forgettable, and common, the kind of vehicle that disappears in any Seattle neighborhood. Elias Morrow, Julian's personal attorney, a sharp-faced man of 38, who had handled Julian's legal affairs for 4 years, and who billed at $450 an hour, was in the passenger seat. They did not speak much according to the footage. Julian parked 2 blocks away, and they walked. Both wore dark jackets. Both kept their heads down under the November rain. Elias carried a small black case. Inside, according to what Tommy Rusk later described from conversations he had overheard, was a device about the size of a television, remote, an electronic lock bypass tool, military grade, the kind that cycles through security frequencies at a rate no human hand could match. To be clear about what that means in plain terms, it does not pick a lock the way you see in movies. It sends a signal that tricks the lock's electronic mechanism into believing the correct code has been entered. The whole process takes under a minute for a standard residential deadbolt. It took Elias 40 seconds to open the back door. I know this because the timestamp on the partial camera footage showed them at the rear fence at 11:41 and inside the house by 11:42. Julian walked through the kitchen without turning on a light. He had grown up in that house. He knew every floorboard, every doorway, every corner. He walked through the dark the way you walk through a place that lives inside your body, without thinking, without hesitating. He went straight to the master bedroom. From the FBI photographs taken weeks later during the investigation, I know what he did next. He crossed to the left side of the room, my side, and placed the black suitcase on the bed. Inside the suitcase were 3 passports, all bearing my photograph, all bearing names that were not mine. 18 bundles of $100 bills totaling $180,000 in cash, and a small encrypted USB drive, black and featureless. It was fabricated evidence. Every piece of it constructed to tell a single story that Arthur Vance, 60 years old, widower, night shift bookkeeper, had been running a money laundering operation and was preparing to disappear. Agent Whitfield told me later that the quality of the fabrication was exceptional. The passports were better than most forgeries the FBI encountered. The cash was real, untraceable, pulled from sources that took months to identify. Whoever had assembled that suitcase had spent considerable time and money doing it correctly. I asked Whitfield who could afford that kind of preparation. He looked at me for a moment before he answered. Someone who had a great deal to lose, he said. While Elias worked in the bedroom, Julian went downstairs to the basement. This is the part that took me the longest to understand, and the part that explained everything else. 5 years earlier, Julian had approached me about a home renovation project. He wanted to reinforce the basement floor, he said. Something about drainage and structural stability. He had offered to pay for it himself, hired the contractors, oversaw the work personally. I had thought it was a generous gesture from a son who wanted to help maintain the family home. What Tommy Rusk told us, and what the FBI later confirmed through the contractor's records, was that the reinforcement work had included the installation of a small climate-controlled cavity beneath the concrete floor, roughly the size of a large suitcase, accessed through a panel concealed behind the water heater. Julian had been using the basement of my home to store a server, a compact encrypted server that held 5 years of financial transaction, data, wire transfers, account numbers, shell company records for an operation that had moved more than $23 million through 47 fictitious companies. He had chosen my house because it was registered in my name, because I had no idea it was there, and because if anyone ever found it, the evidence would point directly at me. That night, he needed it gone. He pried open the panel behind the water heater. He removed the server, and then he set fire to the corner of the basement wall where the cavity had been, not to burn the house down, but to generate enough sustained heat to destroy any forensic trace of what had been stored there. The fire was controlled and deliberate, positioned to damage rather than consume. He was very careful. He had always been very careful. Elias came downstairs when the smoke started, and the two of them left through the back door the same way they had entered. Julian did not look back at the house, according to the footage. Not once. But here is what I think about even now. When Elias reached the car, he stopped beside the passenger door and reached into his jacket. He took something out, something small that caught the light from the street lamp overhead. He looked at it for a moment, turning it over in his fingers. Then he put it back into his inside pocket instead of leaving it behind. At the time, nobody understood what that meant. Tommy Rusk understood. He had seen Elias do the same thing once before, outside a meeting in downtown Seattle, and had wondered about it then. He said Elias had smiled to himself when he put it back in his pocket. The kind of smile, Tommy said, that belongs to a man who thinks he has just given himself an insurance policy. The break room at Pacific Rim Logistics smelled the way it always did, before sunrise burnt coffee, the faint metallic tang of the industrial heaters clicking on, and the particular stillness of a building that hasn't yet decided to wake up. I had spent the last hour at my desk pretending to reconcile inventory sheets, but my eyes hadn't focused on a single column. Every few minutes, my hand drifted toward my phone. Marcus's last message sat there like a stone I couldn't lift. Don't go home tonight. Trust me on this one. I had trusted him. I didn't know why, not fully, not yet, but I had stayed. Dragged a folding chair into the break room around 3 a.m., closed my eyes for what I thought was a few minutes, and apparently surrendered to exhaustion without meaning to. When I opened my eyes again, the clock above the door read 6:10. The fluorescent lights were buzzing at full brightness, and the wall-mounted TV in the corner, the one Frank Styles kept tuned to local news during the day shift, had turned itself on via its morning timer. The first image I saw was fire. Not abstract fire, not some distant warehouse blaze or a highway accident. The aerial drone footage on the screen showed a two-story wooden house with a low picket fence on a street I could have drawn from memory, with my eyes closed. The roofline had partially collapsed. The east-facing windows, the ones in what used to be Helen's sewing room, were completely gone, replaced by black scorched frames like empty eye sockets. The chyron at the bottom of the screen read, "Residential fire in Burien. Arson suspected, one family member speaks out." My legs carried me to the TV before my brain gave the instruction. I stood 3 feet from the screen, still wearing my jacket from the night before, one hand gripping the edge of the counter, so hard my knuckles went white. And we're joined now by Julian Vance, the son of the home's registered owner, Arthur Vance, who has not yet been located by authorities. The camera cut to Julian. He was standing on the sidewalk near the perimeter tape, wearing a charcoal overcoat that probably cost more than my monthly salary. His eyes were red. His jaw was tight in the way that a man's jaw gets tight when he's fighting to hold himself together, or performing the idea of it. A paper coffee cup trembled slightly in his hand. Diane Foley, the king, 5 news anchor conducting the street interview, was a composed woman in her early 40s with precisely cut dark hair and the practiced calm of someone who had delivered bad news thousands of times before. She held the microphone steady and kept her expression neutral the way journalists are trained to do. "Julian," she said, "can you tell us what happened when you arrived this morning?" Julian exhaled slowly. He looked at the ruined house, then back at the camera, and his voice broke just slightly, just enough. "I got a call from a neighbor at around 5 this morning. I drove straight here from downtown. He stopped, pressed his lips together. "I grew up in that house. My mother died in that house. And now someone I don't know who, I don't know why, but someone has taken that from us. Us." I heard the word and felt something cold move through my chest. "Authorities have indicated," Diane Foley continued reading from a notepad, "that the homeowner, your father, Arthur Vance, has not been at the scene and has not contacted police. Is that accurate?" Julian nodded slowly, and for a half second, just a fraction of a second that most viewers would never catch, something move behind his eyes. Not grief, something cooler than grief. "That's what they've told me. I don't want to speculate. I just hope he's safe." He cleared his throat. "I hope he has a good explanation for where he's been." The implication hung in the air between those words the way smoke hangs in a room long after the fire is out. He hadn't said, "I think my father did this." He hadn't needed to. He had let the absence of denial do the work for him. My phone lit up on the break room table. "Marcus, don't turn on the news." I stared at the message. Then I looked at the screen where Diane Foley was now narrating over footage of firefighters pulling debris from what used to be my front hallway. Too late. I typed back with shaking fingers I already did. 3 seconds passed. Then, "Where are you?" Break room, still at the office. Another pause. Then a message that made my stomach drop straight through the floor. "Good. Stay there. Don't talk to anyone. Don't call Julian. I'm 12 minutes away, and I need you to hear what I know before you do anything else." I set the phone down on the table. On the television, the segment had shifted to a wider studio shot, where 2 anchors were now discussing the incident in the measured tones people use when they want to seem neutral about something they've already decided. One of them said the words "persons of interest" and "family estrangement" in the same breath. I pulled out the folding chair and sat down heavily. My hands had stopped shaking, which somehow felt worse, like my body had moved past alarm into something quieter and more dangerous. Helen's sewing room, the east-facing windows, the floor beneath the water heater where the panels didn't quite meet, flush a detail I had always meant to fix and never had. Why that corner of the house? 12 minutes. Marcus had said 12 minutes. I watched the screen go to commercial and stared at my own distorted reflection in the black border of the TV frame, a tired man in a rumpled jacket 60 years old, sitting alone in a break room while his house burned on the morning news, and his son told the city he had a lot of explaining to do. The parking lot behind Pacific Rim Logistics was not a place designed for human comfort. 6 rows of cracked asphalt, a chain-link fence along the south perimeter, a pair of sodium vapor lights that cast everything in a shade of orange that made the whole world look like the inside of a tired old photograph. The rain had picked back up since midnight, the kind of fine, persistent Seattle drizzle that doesn't announce itself dramatically, but simply soaks you through before you realize it's happening. I was standing under the narrow overhang by the loading dock when Marcus pulled in. The truck was a dark green Ford F-150 that looked like it had survived the better part of 2 decades without a single vanity wash. The left rear panel had a long scrape running from the wheel arch to the tailgate, the kind of damage that suggests a story its owner decided wasn't worth telling. The engine knocked once as it cut off, and then Marcus Holt stepped out. He was taller than I had expected. 65 heavy-set through the shoulders with close-cropped gray hair and a face that carried its years without apology. He wore a canvas work jacket over a flannel shirt, and he moved the way men move who spent decades in rooms where moving too fast meant something was wrong. Deliberate, economical, watching everything. A large amber-eyed Labrador hopped down from the passenger seat behind him and sat at his heel without being told. "Rex," Marcus said, and the dog stayed. He crossed the parking lot to where I was standing and looked at me the way a doctor looks at a patient whose chart he's already read. Not unkind, not warm either, just assessing. "You watched the broadcast?" he said. It wasn't a question. "Julian was on camera inside of 3 minutes," I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt. Tie pressed, eyes red, the whole performance. Marcus exhaled through his nose. He had the outfit ready. That tells you something. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a weathered leather notebook, the kind with a snap closure, and held it at his side without opening it. "We should sit in the truck. Out here we're visible from the road." I didn't argue. Rex climbed back in, the moment Marcus opened the rear door, settling across the back seat, with the quiet confidence of an animal who had ridden in that truck 1,000 times before. I took the passenger seat. The cab smelled like coffee motor oil and the particular dry smell of old paper. Marcus set the notebook on the dash and looked straight ahead through the rain-streaked windshield for a moment before he spoke. "My name is Marcus Holt," he said. "For the last 11 years of my career, I was a special agent with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit out of the Seattle field office. I retired 4 years ago. I moved in next to you and Helen about 3 years back." He paused. "What I'm about to tell you isn't something I came to lightly." I turned to look at him. The dashboard clock read 6:41 a.m. "I've been watching your son for 14 months, Marcus said. The sentence landed in the cab of that old Ford like something physical. "Julian," I said, because I needed to say the name out loud to make the sentence real. "Julian Vance, CFO of Meridian Capital Group." Marcus opened the notebook. Inside the pages were dense with handwritten notes, dates, columns of numbers, and several photographs tucked into the back flap. He turned to a page near the middle and held it toward me. "In my former capacity, I worked financial fraud cases, money laundering, shell company networks, fraudulent asset transfers. After I retired, I kept my eyes open. Old habits. A contact at the IRS flagged an unusual pattern about 16 months ago. A trust account registered under your late wife's name was receiving irregular wire transfers from a series of shell companies incorporated in Delaware and Nevada, small amounts, always under the federal reporting threshold of $10,000. But the frequency and the routing structure were consistent with what we call structuring." I stared at the page. The numbers were real. The dates were real. Some of them aligned with the quarterly statements I had received from Helen's estate attorney. Statements I had never looked at carefully enough, because looking at them meant sitting with the fact that Helen was gone, and the account existed because she no longer did. "Structuring," I repeated. I had heard the term before in a general sense. "That's illegal. Federal crime under 31 U.S. Code, Section 5324, Marcus said without hesitation. "Breaking transactions into amounts specifically designed to avoid federal reporting requirements. The intent is to move money without triggering bank scrutiny. Whoever was using Helen's trust account as a pass-through was funneling laundered funds in small increments, then redirecting them outward to a secondary holding structure." He tapped one of the photographs. "That secondary structure traces back to a numbered account in Belize that I've linked through 4 layers of corporate filings to Julian." I realized my hands were pressed flat against my thighs. I couldn't remember putting them there. "He was using Helen's account," I said. The words felt wrong in my mouth. "After she died. He had signatory access as the estate co-executor. It gave him the legal right to move funds." Marcus closed the notebook. What he didn't know, what I don't think he's figured out yet, is that Helen had a secondary mechanism built into that trust. Something that would activate if the account was used in a way that violated the original terms. He glanced at me. Did she ever talk to you about the fund's conditions? I thought back. Helen sitting at the kitchen table the winter before. She got sick with a manila folder and a cup of chamomile tea, telling me in her quiet way that she wanted things set up properly. I want to make sure you're protected, Arthur, no matter what happens. I had nodded and trusted her completely the way I trusted her in everything, and I had never asked exactly what that meant. She told me she had it handled, I said, and my voice broke on the last word, just once, just briefly, like a crack in plaster that tells you the stress is there, even when the surface looks fine. Marcus didn't rush past it. He let the moment sit for a full breath, which was the most respectful thing a man could have done right then. She had more than that handled, he said quietly. But that's a conversation for when Sarah gets here. Sarah, I said. Sarah Jenkins, Seattle PD. She's been working a parallel case for the last 8 months, and she doesn't know I exist yet. He started the engine. She's about to. The wipers swept across the windshield, and the city beyond them looked gray and patient and full of things I hadn't been told yet. What was happening at my house while Marcus and I sat in that parking lot, I only pieced together later through conversations with Sarah Jenkins over the weeks that followed. She told it to me plainly, the way she told everything without embellishment, without sparing details, she thought I might find difficult. I came to appreciate that about her. She treated me like a man who could handle the truth, which at the time was the greatest courtesy anyone had extended to me in years. Sarah Jenkins had been a detective with the Seattle Police Department's Major Crimes Unit for 11 years. She was 42, with close-cropped auburn hair, and the kind of sharp, dark eyes that seemed to be working through a problem, even when the rest of her face was perfectly still. She didn't waste words, and she didn't waste movement. And the other officers at the South Precinct had learned over the years that when Sarah went quiet at a crime scene, it was because she had found something that didn't sit right with her. She arrived at Southwest 152nd Street at 6:14 a.m. when the Seattle Fire Department crews were still running hoses across the front lawn. The eastern side of the house had taken the worst of it. The exterior wall near the utility alcove at the back of the structure had burned hot and fast, the kind of fire pattern that tells an experienced investigator the heat source was concentrated and deliberately placed rather than the result of faulty wiring or an unattended stove. The fire marshal on scene, a heavy-set man named Bridger, who had been doing the job for 20 years, had flagged it as suspected arson within his first 20 minutes of assessment. Sarah had been called in not because of the fire itself, but because of what the first responding officers had found inside the master bedroom. The suitcase was sitting on the bed. It hadn't burned because the bedroom was on the west side of the house, separated from the fire's origin point by 2 full walls and a hallway. Whoever had placed it there had known exactly where the fire would travel and where it wouldn't. That detail, that precision was the first thing Sarah noted in her field log. She snapped on her gloves and opened it. Inside were 3 passports bearing Arthur Vance's photograph, 18 bundled packets of cash totaling $180,000, and a USB drive wrapped in a cloth pouch at the bottom. The forensic team would catalog each item in full. What made Sarah stop was not what was in the suitcase. It was how it had been arranged, clean, deliberate, each item placed as if the person who packed it had done so, knowing exactly who would find it and what conclusion they were meant to draw. Sarah didn't open the drive. At the scene, protocol required a forensic imaging process before any digital evidence was accessed to prevent contamination of the data chain. But she photographed everything, logged every item, and then stood at the foot of the bed for a long moment looking at the arrangement. It was too clean. Not the room. The room was smoky, and the ceiling tiles above the hallway door had warped from heat exposure. She meant the evidence itself. A guilty man running would not leave his forged identities in an open suitcase on the bed of his burning house. He would take them. The entire point of a false passport was mobility, the ability to disappear. Leaving them behind served no purpose for the person they were supposedly designed to protect, unless they were never meant to help Arthur Vance escape. They were meant to be found. She walked the perimeter of the bedroom a second time, and on the east wall near the baseboard, behind the bedroom door, she found a single sheet of paper that had partially survived the smoke damage. It was a financial document, a beneficiary amendment form for a trust account dated 8 months prior. The signature line at the bottom bore the name Helen R. Vance. Sarah pulled out her phone and photographed it. Then she leaned closer and looked at the signature itself under her flashlight. Helen R. Vance. The letters were even carefully spaced and completely consistent in their pressure from first stroke to last. That was the problem. Sarah had been through hundreds of signed documents in her career. Real signatures, the ones people write without thinking, because their hand has done it 10,000 times, are never perfectly consistent. They vary. The pressure changes mid-stroke. The terminal letters trail off or hook upward, depending on how quickly the person was writing, whether they were standing or sitting, whether they were tired or alert. A signature that looks too composed, too measured, is almost always a copy, someone tracing a signature they've practiced, rather than a person simply signing their name. She bagged the document. Bridget, she called toward the hallway. The fire marshal appeared in the doorway. Yeah. The burn origin at the utility alcove. Was there anything structural in that section of the floor? Subfloor cavity access panel? Anything like that? Bridger scratched the back of his neck. We pulled some debris off what looked like a floor panel behind the water heater housing, melted clean through. Whatever was in the cavity below it, if anything, would have been exposed to direct heat for at least 40 minutes. Anything recovered? Some metal fragments, consistent with electronic housing circuit board material, maybe a small chassis. We've got it bagged for forensics. Sarah looked back at the suitcase on the bed, then at the bagged document in her hand, then at the doorway through which, if she walked far enough, she would reach the utility alcove where something electronic had been deliberately reduced to slag. Two separate acts, she thought, one designed to be found, one designed to be destroyed. Whoever did this had two goals, and they were not the same goal. She stepped back out into the hallway and dialed the South Precinct to request a full forensic team and a financial crimes liaison. As she waited for the line to connect, she looked through the scorched window frame at the end of the hall at the gray morning sky and the rain and the small crowd of neighbors gathered beyond the tape line. She didn't know yet about Marcus Holt. She didn't know yet about the notebook in the old Ford or the man sitting in a break room on East Marginal Way who had watched his own house burn on the morning news. But she had the forged signature in her hand, and that was enough to tell her that the obvious story, guilty father, grieving son, was not the real one. Not even close. Marcus didn't drive toward anything in particular at first. He just drove south on East Marginal Way, then west toward the water, as if putting distance between us and the building was the point rather than the destination. Rex sat in the back with his chin on the seat divider, breathing slow and even. The rain had thinned to a mist that the wipers handled in long, lazy sweeps. I watched the Port of Seattle pass by, on my right cranes, standing motionless in the gray morning container, ships sitting low and patient in the water. And I thought about how the world keeps its enormous machinery running, regardless of what any single person is going through. The cranes didn't know my house had burned. The ships didn't know my son had stood in front of a camera and implied I was a fugitive. You said Helen's account had a secondary mechanism, I said. But before that, before any of that, I need to understand why you're here. Why you moved in next door. Why it was you who called me last night. Marcus kept his eyes on the road. His jaw tightened slightly. Not defensiveness I would come to understand, but the particular tension of a man preparing to say something he has rehearsed many times and still doesn't have the right words for. Her name is Brooke, he said. My daughter. She's 28 now. He said it the way fathers say their children's ages, not as a fact, but as something they're still getting used to. 4 years ago, she was 24. She had a master's degree in financial analysis from the University of Washington. She was smart, the kind of smart that made me nervous for her, honestly, because smart people in finance tend to trust the math more than they trust their instincts about the people running the numbers. He paused. She took a position as a junior analyst at Meridian Capital Group, Julian's firm. I turned to look at him. She was good at her job, Marcus continued. Too good, maybe. Inside of 18 months, she had worked her way into the risk assessment division. She was reviewing internal fund structures, the ones that handled high net worth client portfolios. And she found something that didn't line up. What did she find? Meridian was managing roughly $400 million in client assets across a series of funds that were marketed to investors as low to moderate risk. Conservative allocations, bonds, municipal securities, stable dividend stocks. That's what the prospectuses said. What Brooke found in the internal ledgers was different. Significant portions of those funds were being quietly redirected through a secondary layer of accounts that weren't disclosed to investors and parked in structures that served as holding vehicles for laundered cash. Marcus's voice stayed level, but his grip on the steering wheel shifted. She flagged it internally to her department supervisor. A week later, she was placed on administrative leave. 2 weeks after that, she was terminated. The stated reason was performance issues. Her personnel file had been retroactively amended with negative reviews she had never received or signed. The cruelty of it was almost elegant. Not a threat, not a warning. Just a clean erasure, her record rewritten, her credibility, preemptively destroyed her future in financial analysis, effectively ended before she could speak. "She came to me," Marcus said. "Obviously she came to me. I was her father, and I had spent 20 years in federal investigations. She brought me everything she had copied before they locked her out of the system. I looked at what she'd found, and I knew within 2 hours that it was real. The structure she had identified was consistent with layering techniques I had seen in a dozen cases during my career. Clean on the surface, untraceable, unless you knew what you were looking for." He exhaled. The problem was that she no longer had institutional standing. A terminated junior analyst with amended performance reviews, any defense attorney would have shredded her in a deposition. Without corroborating evidence from inside Meridian, we had nothing that would hold up. "What happened to her?" I asked, though. Something in the way he had spoken her name from the beginning told me the answer was not going to be straightforward. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Outside, the mist thickened briefly and the wipers moved faster without him reaching for the dial. The truck had its own rhythms, its own muscle memory. "She tried to move on," he said finally. "Applied to other firms. Every application hit a wall she couldn't see, but I could see it. Her name was appearing in informal industry communications that questioned her reliability. The kind of thing that's never written down, anywhere actionable, that's never said out loud in a room with witnesses. But that travels through a professional network, like smoke through a building." His voice tightened for the first time. "She lost her apartment. She moved back in with me. And one morning about 2 years ago, I found her sitting on the kitchen floor at 4 a.m., and she couldn't tell me why she was there. She just sat there, and her hands were shaking, and she said she didn't know how to keep being a person anymore. That morning was what started all of it. 2 years of watching her rebuild herself, and 14 months of watching Julian, one following directly from the other. She got help," Marcus said. "Real help, the kind that takes a long time and costs more than it should, and doesn't come with a finish line. She's doing better now. She's living in Portland. She has a part-time position with a nonprofit that does financial literacy work for low-income households." He allowed himself a short breath that was almost not quite a sound of relief. But what Julian's company did to her, the systematic destruction of her professional life, the retaliation for doing exactly what an analyst is supposed to do, that never got answered for. Because without someone inside Meridian willing to talk, without corroborating evidence, it was her word against a $400 million firm with a full legal department. He turned north onto First Avenue South, and the industrial waterfront gave way to the first commercial blocks of So-Do. The streetlights still lit against the pale morning. "I retired with a pension and no particular reason to stop working," Marcus said. "So I didn't stop. I relocated. I put myself next door to a man whose late wife's trust account had started receiving unusual transfers. And I watched. He glanced at me for the first time since he'd started talking. "I want you to understand something, Arthur. I am not using you. Everything I know, I will give to law enforcement through the proper channels. But I needed proximity to the evidence. And your house was the closest point. I thought about Helen, about the night she sat at the kitchen table with the manila folder and told me she had things handled. She knew," I said, not a question. Marcus turned back to the road. "I think she suspected. I think she built something into that trust to protect you from a threat she couldn't name out loud." The truck moved through the wet morning, and I felt the weight of everything I hadn't known settle across my shoulders like something permanent, the way grief settles, the way responsibility settles, the way love settles when it outlasts the person who gave it to you. Somewhere behind us, Sarah Jenkins was standing in the ashes of my house, holding a document with my dead wife's forged signature. And somewhere ahead of us was whatever came next. Occidental Square in Pioneer Square is the kind of place that looks like Seattle decided at some point in the late 19th century to build something worth keeping and then mostly succeeded. Cobblestone plaza, old-growth timber, totem poles, brick buildings with arched windows that have been law offices and galleries and coffee shops depending on the decade. At 7:15 in the morning, on a Thursday in November, it was nearly empty. A man walking a terrier on the far end of the plaza, a delivery truck idling on the street, and the lights on inside a narrow coffee shop called Elm and Ground that Marcus apparently knew well enough to have a preferred table. Rex was looped to a cast-iron bench outside. He sat with the patience of an animal who understood that waiting was not the same as being forgotten. Marcus had called ahead. Sarah Jenkins was already there when we walked in, seated at the table farthest from the door. Her back to the wall, a cup of black coffee in front of her, and a folder open on the table that she closed the moment she saw us. She looked at Marcus first, then at me, and I watched her run the same quick assessment she probably ran on everyone who entered a room. "Arthur Vance," she said. Not a greeting exactly, more like a confirmation. "Detective Jenkins," Marcus said, pulling out the chair across from her. "Thank you for coming. I came because you said you had 14 months of documented surveillance on Julian Vance, and you'd hand it to me directly." She looked at Marcus with the kind of directness that doesn't leave room for social cushioning. "I don't know who you are yet. I know your name, and I know your former bureau. I'd like to know the rest before I share anything from my investigation." Marcus set his leather notebook on the table between them and opened it to the first page. He talked for 11 minutes without interruption, his background, the IRS contact, the trust account pattern Brooks experienced at Meridian, the 14 months of documentation. Sarah didn't write anything down. She didn't need to. I watched her absorb it the way a person absorbs information they have been half expecting. Not with surprise, but with the particular expression of someone watching a missing piece cross the table toward them. When Marcus finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she picked up the notebook and turned to the photographs in the back. "These are time-stamped," she said. "Dated and cross-referenced with the financial transaction logs on the adjacent pages," Marcus said. "Everything is admissible. I was a private citizen conducting lawful observation from my own property and public spaces. No surveillance devices were placed on property I didn't have access to." Sarah set the notebook down and picked up her coffee. "I need to tell you both something that is not yet public." She looked at me directly. "Mr. Vance, you are currently listed as a person of interest in the Burien fire investigation. That's standard procedure when the registered owner of a property cannot be located and there's potential evidence of criminal activity at the scene. It does not mean you've been charged with anything. It means you need legal representation before you speak to anyone in my department other than me, and it means you should not leave the greater Seattle area." I nodded. My throat felt tight, but I kept my voice level. "Understood." "Good." She opened her folder again. "Now, the security cameras at your property there were 3 exterior units and 1 interior unit in the front hallway. All 4 were disabled between 10:47 and 10:49 p.m. last night. A 2-minute window." She turned a printed page toward us. It showed a technical log from the camera system's cloud backup server. The method used was not a physical disconnection. Someone pushed a remote kill command through the camera system's firmware, a command that overwrote the device operating software and rendered all 4 units permanently non-functional. The cloud backup stopped receiving data at 10:47. Marcus leaned forward. "What protocol?" "Our digital forensics unit identified the signature as consistent with a tool that has appeared in 3 previous federal cases, 2 of them involving corporate espionage, 1 involving a contract operation with ties to a private military contractor based in Virginia." Sarah's voice didn't change in register, but the weight behind the words increased measurably. "It is not something a private individual purchases off the shelf. It requires either direct access to the tool through a government or defense contractor channel, or a connection to someone who does." I thought about Julian, about his Cartier cufflinks and his corner office and his $400 million firm, about how I had watched him grow from a boy who used to fall asleep on the couch with his head on Helen's shoulder into something I no longer recognized. "It's Victor Raines," Marcus said. Sarah looked at him sharply. "He was Julian's deputy CFO at Meridian until approximately 8 months ago," Marcus said. "He left under circumstances that were described publicly as a mutual parting, but that my documentation suggests were significantly less mutual. He may be in a position to corroborate the internal financial structure Brooke identified, and he may have knowledge of how Julian acquired access to that class of software tool. Marcus tapped a page in his notebook. I have a last known address in Bellevue. I haven't approached him because I wanted law enforcement present when that conversation happened. Sarah studied him for a long moment. Then she made a decision that I could see move across her face, not a visible expression so much as a shift in posture, a settling like a person who has weighed something and committed to the weight. I'm going to bring you in as an informal consulting resource, she said to Marcus. Unpaid, unofficial, everything you provide goes through me before it goes anywhere else. If you share anything from your documentation with anyone outside this table before I authorize it, it compromises the chain of evidence and potentially kills a prosecution. She turned to me. Mr. Vance, I need a full statement from you, everything from last night, starting from when you received Marcus's call. I need it on record and I need it today. Do you have an attorney? No, I said. Get one before this afternoon. I can give you a referral if you need one. Someone who handles wrongful accusation cases and won't run up a bill you can't pay. She closed the folder and looked at both of us with the expression of a person who has just agreed to carry considerably more than she arrived expecting to carry. I'll reach out to Victor Raines through official channels this morning. If he's willing to talk, we move on the financial records. If he's not, she paused. Then we use what we have and we build from the other direction. She tucked the folder under her arm and picked up her coffee. One more thing, she said, looking at me. The document we recovered with your wife's signature, it's being analyzed by our forensic document unit. If the forgery is confirmed, that changes the entire evidentiary picture. It means someone inside Julian's operation had access to Helen's original signatures and the technical skill to replicate them. Her voice dropped slightly, not with softness, but with a kind of precision that told me she understood what she was about to say would cost me something to hear. Your wife may have built protections into that trust, specifically because she anticipated this. If that's true, she may have saved your life. She left without waiting for my response. The door closed behind her, and the coffee shop settled back into its quiet morning sounds. The hiss of the espresso machine, the low murmur of the only other occupied table across the room. I looked at Marcus. My eyes were burning in a way I refused to give into, right then in a fluorescent-lit coffee shop at 7:30 in the morning, because if I started, I was not sure I would be able to stop. She said Helen may have saved my life, I said. Marcus wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. Helen was the smartest person either of us knew, he said quietly. She just never made a fuss about it. Before I go any further, if you're still here with me, drop the number 9 in the comments right now. That's all, just 9. It tells me you're in this with me, and honestly, that means everything. Quick note, the story ahead contains some fictional elements built for narrative and educational purposes. It may not reflect events exactly as they occurred. If that's not something you'd like to continue with, this is a good place to step away. No hard feelings at all. Marcus had gone inside the precinct to meet with Sarah's supervisor and establish his consulting paperwork. He told me to stay in the truck, keep the doors locked, and not answer calls from numbers I didn't recognize. Rex was in the back seat again, and I was grateful for his company in a way that would have embarrassed me to admit out loud. There is something steadying about an animal that doesn't know anything is wrong. I sat in the passenger seat of the old Ford on a side street off 3rd Avenue and watched Seattle wake up around me. Foot traffic thickening on the sidewalks, a food cart opening its window 2 blocks north, the ordinary texture of a Thursday morning that had no idea what was moving underneath it. My phone buzzed. A text from a number I didn't recognize containing only a link. I almost didn't open it. Then I recognized the King 5 News domain in the URL and tapped it. It was a live stream. The feed showed the exterior steps of Seattle Police Department headquarters on 5th Avenue, a podium, a cluster of microphones, 3 officers in dress uniform standing to one side. Sarah Jenkins stood at the podium in a charcoal blazer, her expression calibrated to the precise register of official gravity. Behind her, a printed photograph was mounted on a display board. It was my work AD photo from Pacific Rim Logistics, taken 2 years ago. I looked tired in it, which was accurate. Sarah leaned into the microphones. At approximately 11 p.m. last Wednesday, a residential fire was set at a property in Burien, Washington. The Seattle Fire Department has confirmed the cause as deliberate arson. In connection with this investigation, The Seattle Police Department is seeking information regarding the whereabouts of Arthur Vance, 60 years of age, a resident of the Berrien neighborhood. Mr. Vance has not been located since the incident and has not contacted authorities. Anyone with information is asked to contact the SPD tip line. She did not use the words arrested or charged. She did not have to. The photograph, the podium, the dress uniforms, the visual grammar of the press conference did the work. By the time the evening news ran, the implication would be settled in the public mind like sediment in still water. I lowered my phone. My hands were not shaking, which surprised me. What I felt instead was something colder than fear, a kind of clarity that comes when the situation you're in becomes undeniable enough that your body stops wasting energy on hoping it isn't real. My phone rang. Marcus. "You watched it," he said when I answered. "Yes." "Good. Then you understand why she did it." His voice was even almost businesslike. "Julian has been monitoring local news feeds since this morning. His legal team will see that press conference within the hour. The moment they believe you're a wanted fugitive, that police resources are directed toward finding you, they will relax. People make mistakes when they relax." She's using me as bait," I said. "She's using the idea of you," Marcus said. "There's a difference. You are sitting in my truck 3 blocks from her office. You are the safest you have been since last night." I looked out the window at the ordinary street. A woman pushed a stroller past the hood of the Ford without glancing up. "What happens when Julian finds out it was staged?" I asked. "By then, we'll have what we need from Victor Rains." The name landed with weight. I had heard it first in the coffee shop, Julian's former deputy CFO, the man who left Meridian 8 months ago, under circumstances that were described publicly as mutual and privately were not. Marcus had a last known address in Bellevue. Sarah had reached out through official channels that morning. As if on cue, Marcus said, "Sarah just got a call. Victor Rains agreed to meet." I exhaled slowly. "When?" "This afternoon. He asked for a neutral location, somewhere public, not a precinct." He sounded scared, Arthur, not cautious, scared. A pause. "That means he knows something worth being scared about." Outside the truck, a city bus rolled past and briefly blocked the light. When it cleared, the street looked exactly the same as before, unchanged and different, moving at its own pace. I thought about Julian at that podium on King 5 2 days ago. His eyes red and his voice carefully broken, saying, "I just hope he has a good explanation for where he's been." I thought about how effortlessly the performance had come to him, how practiced it looked, how long it must have taken to get that good at it. I thought about the boy who used to fall asleep on Helen's shoulder on Sunday afternoons, his shoes still on, his hair pushed sideways against the cushion. I had loved that boy without reservation. I had believed with the particular confidence of a father who hasn't been given reason to doubt that the man he became would carry something of that boy forward. The grief of being wrong about that was not a sharp thing. It was wide and quiet, like a field after rain, the kind of pain that doesn't announce itself loudly, but takes up so much space there is nothing left around it. My phone buzzed again. A message from Sarah this time, through a number Marcus had given me that morning as her secure contact line. "Press conference is done. Julian's attorney called the tip line within 22 minutes. They're watching. Stay where you are. Victor meeting confirmed 2 p.m. Zeitgeist, Coffee First Avenue South. Be there." I read the message twice. Then I set the phone face down on my knee and looked at Rex in the back seat. He was watching me with the calm, amber patience of an animal that has decided for reasons of its own that I was worth keeping an eye on. "All right," I said to no one in particular. The morning was still moving, and so apparently were we. Marcus drove us to Greta's house before noon. It was 3 blocks west of what used to be my house, close enough that from Greta's front porch on a clear day, you could see the roofline of Southwest 152nd Street. Today there was no clear day. The November sky had settled into a flat pewter gray that pressed down on the neighborhood like a lid, and the smell of wet cedar and chimney smoke hung in the air, the way it does in the older parts of Burien when autumn decides it has been patient long enough. Greta Simmons answered the door before Marcus had finished knocking. She was 68, with silver hair cut short and practical, and the kind of face that has spent a long time outdoors, weathered in a way that suggested gardening and early mornings, rather than hardship. She wore a green cardigan over a flannel shirt, and she was already reaching for my arm before I had stepped fully onto the porch. "Arthur," she said, and the way she said it quietly with both hands wrapping around my forearm told me she had been expecting me and had been frightened for me and was relieved I was standing upright. "Greta," I said. My voice came out rougher than I intended. She pulled me inside without ceremony. The kitchen was exactly the kind of kitchen that accumulates warmth over decades rather than designing for it. Mismatched mugs on open shelves, a window over the sink with a small herb garden on the sill, a round table with 4 chairs that didn't quite match each other. A kettle was already on the stove. She had known we were coming. Marcus settled into a chair with the ease of someone who had sat in it before. I took the chair across from him. Rex curled under the table without being invited, which Greta acknowledged only by setting a small bowl of water near the baseboards without comment. "I saw the news this morning," Greta said, setting 3 mugs on the table. "I saw Julian on that television. She said his name the way you say the name of something that has disappointed you past the point of surprise. Helen would have known. She always knew with that boy." "What do you mean?" I asked. Greta sat down and wrapped her hands around her mug. "Helen came to me, it must have been 2 winters ago, maybe a little more. She had just come back from her attorney's office. She sat in that chair you're sitting in right now, and she drank 2 full cups of tea, which was unusual for her, because she never had more than one, and then she said something I have thought about nearly every day since." The kettle began to whistle softly. Greta didn't move to take it off. She said, "Greta, I've built a door that only opens from the inside. If Julian ever tries to walk through the money, the door opens the other way, and everything falls on him instead of Arthur." Greta looked at me steadily. I didn't fully understand what she meant at the time. I thought it was an expression. But she was very calm when she said it, the way Helen was calm about serious things. Not cold, calm. Like she had already done the hard thinking and was at peace with the decision. I set my mug down. My chest felt tight in a way that had nothing to do with the warm room. "And she never told me," I said. "She didn't want you to carry it," Greta said simply. "That was Helen. She would take on the weight of a thing herself rather than hand it to someone she loved. You know that better than anyone." I did know that. I knew it in the way you know things about a person you have lived alongside for 31 years, not as a fact you could recite, but as a texture, a rhythm, something present in the ordinary details of a shared life. Helen folding laundry at midnight because she couldn't sleep. Helen paying bills 2 weeks early because she couldn't stand the uncertainty of due dates. Helen sitting at the kitchen table with a manila folder, quiet and thorough, making sure everything was in order for a future she suspected might be more complicated than the one we'd planned. "Did she say anything else?" Marcus asked. His voice was gentle the way it got when he was listening for something specific without wanting to lead the witness. Greta thought for a moment. "She said the trigger was automatic, that it didn't require anyone to do anything, that if certain conditions were met inside the account, the mechanism would activate on its own and report directly to a federal financial oversight body." She paused. She used the phrase "dead man's switch." I remember because I had to look it up afterward. Marcus and I exchanged a look across the table. In information security and legal trust structures, a dead man's switch is exactly what it sounds like, a mechanism that activates not when someone takes an action, but when a predefined condition is met and no one intervenes to stop it. Helen had built one into her trust account. If Julian moved money in violation of the trust's original terms, and if no authorized party flagged the transaction as legitimate within a set window, the switch would fire automatically, sending a full transaction report to a federal oversight body without requiring Arthur, Marcus, or Sarah to do anything at all. "She filed it herself," Marcus said quietly, more to himself than to either of us. "She didn't tell a lawyer, she didn't tell Arthur. She just built it and let it sit there." "Like a key hidden under a stone," Greta said, "for a door she hoped would never need opening." Outside, the rain came back in earnest against the kitchen window, against the cedar siding, against the quiet neighborhood that used to contain my house and now contained its ruins 3 blocks east. I sat in Helen's chair in her friend's kitchen, and I felt her presence so acutely it was almost unbearable. Not a ghost, nothing so dramatic as that. Just the shape of a person who had loved me carefully enough to protect me from something she couldn't bring herself to name out loud. "Yeah, thank you, Greta," I said, my voice held barely. She reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. "She would want you to fight," she said. "You know she would." I did know that. And for the first time since Marcus's call had pulled me out of a quiet Wednesday night shift and dropped me into whatever this was, I felt something underneath the fear and the grief and the exhaustion that I recognized slowly as resolve. We had a meeting in 2 hours. Victor Raines was waiting. Zeitgeist. Coffee on First Avenue South was the kind of place that attracted people who needed to think high ceilings, exposed brick, the low industrial hum of a building that used to be something else before it became somewhere to sit with a cup of coffee and pretend the world outside wasn't pressing in. At 2 in the afternoon, it was half full, which was exactly crowded enough to be anonymous and exactly quiet enough to hear a conversation at close range. Victor Rains was already there when we arrived. He was 50 years old, but he looked older, the particular aging that comes not from years, but from sustained stress, the kind that hollows out the space behind the eyes. He had the build of a man who had once been athletic and had spent the last several years at a desk. His suit was good quality, but worn at the cuffs, and he was sitting with both hands wrapped around a coffee cup. He clearly wasn't drinking, watching the door with an expression that belonged on a man waiting for news he already knew was bad. He looked at Sarah first, then at Marcus, then at me, and something moved across his face, recognition, or something close to it. "You look like your wife," he said. "Helen. Julian kept a photograph of her on his desk for years. I always thought it was for appearances. Now, I think it was something else." I didn't respond to that. I wasn't ready to. Sarah sat across from him and set a small digital recorder on the table between them. "Mr. Rains, I want to be clear about your status before we begin. You are here voluntarily. You are not under arrest or compelled to speak. Anything you share today can be used in a federal investigation, and I would strongly recommend you have retained legal counsel before this conversation." "Have you done that?" Victor nodded. "I called my attorney this morning. She's aware I'm meeting with you." He reached into his jacket and produced a business card, sliding it across to Sarah. "She said to give you that and to tell you she'll be filing a formal whistleblower disclosure with the SEC by end of business today on my behalf. Under the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform Act, a whistleblower who voluntarily provides original information about securities violations to the Securities and Exchange Commission is entitled to legal protections against retaliation, and in certain cases, financial awards based on sanctions collected. Victor Rains, by filing formally, was placing himself under that protective framework before he said another word. Sarah pocketed the card. "Go ahead," Victor exhaled. "I was Julian's deputy CFO at Meridian for 6 years. For the first 4, I believed the firm was operating legitimately aggressively, yes, with structures that pushed compliance boundaries, but within legal limits." He paused. 2 years ago, I was brought into a meeting with Julian and 2 individuals I later identified as representatives of a holding company registered in the Cayman Islands. The discussion involved redirecting a portion of client fund assets through a series of pass-through accounts in a way that would not appear on quarterly disclosures. When I raised compliance concerns, Julian told me it was already approved at the board level and that my role was execution, not judgment. "Did you execute it?" Sarah asked. Victor's jaw tightened. "For 4 months. Then I started keeping copies of everything." He reached into his coat again and produced a USB drive, matte black, no markings, and set it on the table beside the recorder. This contains transaction logs, internal communications, and account structure diagrams covering approximately $23 million in redirected assets over a 5-year period. The routing goes through 47 shell companies across 6 jurisdictions. The terminal accounts connect back to Julian personally through 2 layers of nominee ownership. Sarah picked up the drive without touching the contact points and placed it in an evidence bag she produced from her jacket pocket. "There's something else," Victor said. He looked at me directly for the first time since we'd sat down. 3 weeks ago, I received an automated notification from a financial monitoring service I had never subscribed to. The notification referenced a trust account under the name of Helen R. Vance, and indicated that an automatic compliance report had been filed with FinCEN, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, which is the division of the U.S. Treasury responsible for receiving suspicious activity reports from financial institutions. He leaned forward. The report was generated automatically triggered by a predefined condition written into the trust's governing document. It had been sitting dormant for over 2 years. It fired when Julian's transfer activity crossed a threshold that Helen's attorney had specified in the original trust language. The table was very quiet. "Helen filed it herself," Marcus said. He wasn't asking. "Her attorney filed the trust documentation, but the mechanism was Helen's design," Victor said. "I know because Julian found out about it 3 weeks ago. I was in the room when he did." something crossed Victor's face. Not quite fear, not quite disgust, but the particular expression of a man who has watched another person reveal exactly who they are. He didn't say anything for almost a minute. Then he said, "She's been dead for 2 years and she's still out maneuvering me." And then he started planning the fire. I pressed my hands flat on the table. The wood grain was cool under my palms. I focused on that, the specific temperature of the surface, the physical fact of it. Because if I didn't anchor myself to something concrete, I was going to come apart in the middle of a coffee shop on First Avenue, and that was not something I was willing to do. Helen had known, not suspected known. She had built a legal mechanism precise enough to survive her own death patient, enough to wait 2 years, and targeted enough to fire at exactly the right moment. She had sat at that kitchen table with her chamomile tea and her manila folder, and she had quietly constructed the thing that would eventually bring her son to justice. And she had never said a word about it to me, because she didn't want me to carry the weight of knowing. "Tommy Rusk," Sarah said, looking at Victor. "Julian's IT staff. Do you know where he is?" Victor nodded slowly. "He contacted me 2 weeks ago. He's in Tacoma. He has a full copy of the server data that Julian thought he destroyed in the fire." A pause. "He's terrified." Sarah closed her notebook. "I'll have agents in Tacoma by this evening." Outside the coffee shop windows, the afternoon rain moved through Pioneer Square in long gray curtains bending around the corner of the brick buildings and pulling at the awnings. I sat with my hands flat on the table and thought about Helen, about the weight she had carried alone, and the precision with which she had carried it. She had built a door, she had told Greta, one that only opened from the inside. It had just opened. Sarah called me at 4:17 in the afternoon. I was in the passenger seat of Marcus's truck again, parked on a side street near the waterfront, while Marcus walked Rex along the seawall. The rain had stopped for the first time all day, leaving the city with that particular washed-out brightness that Seattle gets in the late afternoon of a November day, pale light, long shadows, everything looking slightly more fragile than it did in the morning. I answered on the second ring. "The forensics report came back on the object recovered from the bedroom baseboard," Sarah said. She didn't waste time on preamble. "It's a tie clip. Cartier Platinum Limited production run from 2019. Approximately $1,200 retail. The series had a total production of 200 units sold through Cartier boutiques in North America." A pause. "We ran the serial number engraved on the interior clasp through Cartier's retail records. The clip was purchased in October 2019 at the Cartier boutique in Bellevue Square. The billing name on the transaction was Julian Vance." I held the phone very still against my ear. "He left it at the scene," I said. "Elias Morrow left it at the scene," Sarah said. "Based on what we reconstructed from that night at the house and the physical evidence, Morrow pocketed the clip deliberately before leaving. He intended to use it as leverage personal insurance against Julian if the arrangement ever turned against him." Her voice stayed level, but something underneath it had sharpened. "The problem is that Elias Morrow is no longer in a position to use it." What happened? Washington State Patrol responded to a single vehicle accident on southbound Urifa near the Boeing Field interchange at approximately 2:40 p.m. today. A black Mercedes S-Class left the roadway at highway speed and struck the concrete median barrier. The driver was pronounced dead at the scene. A brief pause. The vehicle was registered to Elias Morrow, attorney at law, with offices in Bellevue. The afternoon light outside the truck window looked exactly the same as it had 30 seconds ago. The world had not adjusted its appearance to account for what Sarah had just told me. "The brake line," I said. "Washington State Patrol's initial assessment was mechanical failure. Our accident reconstruction unit requested a joint examination of the vehicle this afternoon. Under an emergency coordination protocol, we have jurisdiction because the driver is connected to an active arson and fraud investigation." Sarah's tone was careful and precise. "Preliminary findings from the reconstruction team indicate the brake hydraulic line had been compromised at a single point, consistent with deliberate mechanical interference, a clean cut, partially through the line, designed to fail gradually under sustained highway braking, rather than immediately. Whoever did it understood vehicle mechanics well enough to make it look plausible as where failure. The precision of it was what made it terrible, not rage calculation. The same quality that had produced 3 forged passports and a military-grade camera kill and a carefully practiced expression of grief for a television camera. Julian didn't act from emotion. He acted from arithmetic. He's removing witnesses, I said. He's removing liabilities, Sarah said. There's a distinction, and it matters legally. First-degree murder in Washington state requires proof of premeditation, deliberate planning prior to the act. The method here, a partial brake line cut, timed to fail on a highway, strongly indicates premeditation. Combined with motive, which we can establish through the extortion dynamic between Julian and Morrow, this moves us from financial crime territory into homicide investigation. She let that sit for a moment. Arthur, I need you to understand what that means for the timeline. A homicide investigation involves a different set of resources and a different chain of command within the department. The FBI field office has already been briefed on the financial elements through the FinCEN report. Agent Whitfield's unit will now be formally brought in on the homicide component as well. Another pause. Julian is escalating. He has eliminated the one person who had direct physical evidence linking him to your house. He may believe he's closing his exposure. He doesn't know about Victor, I said. Not yet, and he doesn't know about Tommy Rusk. I heard papers moving on her end. My agents reached Tommy in Tacoma 40 minutes ago. He's cooperative. He has a full mirror copy of the server data on an encrypted external drive backed up to a cloud account registered under a name Julian wouldn't recognize. The data is intact. Outside, Marcus was coming back along the seawall with Rex walking at his heel. I watched them move through the pale afternoon light. The old man and his old dog unhurried, steady, moving the way things move when they have decided on their direction. On the tie clip, I said. It places Julian at the scene directly. It places his property at the scene. Combined with the digital evidence from Victor's USB, Tommy's server copy, and the FinCEN report, it forms one point in a chain of physical evidence that a prosecutor can present to a jury. Sarah's voice took on the particular flatness of someone reading from a mental checklist. We are building a case, Arthur. It takes the shape it needs to take, not the shape we want it to take. Right now, the shape is good. I watched Marcus reach the truck and open the rear door for Rex. He looked at me through the windshield and raised his chin slightly, the gesture of a man asking if everything was all right without wanting to shout it across a parking lot. I gave him a short nod that I hoped looked more confident than it felt. What's next? I asked Sarah. Tonight, she said, we let Julian think he's winning. The motel on Aurora Avenue North was called the Cascade Rest, which was the kind of name that promised more than the building delivered. 2 floors of exterior access rooms, a parking lot with a broken light in the northwest corner, and a vending machine in the breezeway that dispensed coffee that tasted like it had been waiting there since the previous administration. Marcus had paid for the room in cash under his own name, less traceable than a credit card linked to mine, and had walked me up to room 14 at 6 in the evening, with Rex at his heel and a paper bag containing a sandwich and a bottle of water. "And get some rest if you can," he had said at the door. "Sarah will be in touch." He had left, and I had sat on the edge of the bed in a room that smelled of industrial detergent and stale heat, and I had looked at the wall for a while without particular purpose. The room was a specific kind of lonely, not the loneliness of being without company. I had spent years of night shifts in empty offices, and I had made a kind of peace with solitude long before Helen died. This was the loneliness of displacement, of being a person who had a house and a routine and a quiet life, and now had none of those things, sitting in a room that belonged to no one, waiting for other people to tell him what came next. I ate half the sandwich. I couldn't manage the rest. At 7:43 p.m., Sarah sent a message through the secure line. Tommy Rusk has agreed to a recorded video call. 2-party consent, confirmed he's been advised by FBI counsel, and has signed the consent form. Call initiates in 10 minutes. Use the app Marcus installed on the burner phone. I found the phone in the paper bag beneath the water bottle, a basic prepaid device Marcus had handed me before leaving with a single application already open. I sat back against the headboard and waited. Tommy Rusk appeared on the screen at 7:55. He was 27, but looked younger under the fluorescent light of wherever he was. A nondescript room with white walls and a folding table, the visual texture of every temporary FBI safe location in every city in America. He had the hollow-eyed alertness of someone who had not slept properly in days, and he was sitting very straight in his chair, the way people sit when they are trying to appear less frightened than they are. "Mr. Vance," he said. His voice was steadier than his eyes. "Tommy," I said, "thank you for doing this." He exhaled slowly. "I should have done it 6 months ago. I knew what the data contained. I kept telling myself it wasn't my responsibility, that I was just Infrastructure that the decisions being made on top of the systems I maintained had nothing to do with me. His jaw tightened. Then Julian told me to wipe the server, and I realized that wiping it made me responsible for what disappeared with it. So I made a copy first, and then I wiped it, and then I drove to Tacoma, and I didn't go back. And the copy you made, I said, is it complete? I full mirror image of the server partition Julian used for the Meridian secondary accounts. Every transaction record, every internal communication, every account routing diagram from the last 5 years. It's all there. He looked directly at the camera. Mr. Vance, I want you to know something. I worked at Meridian for 3 years. I heard Julian talk about you twice, both times in the context of the trust account. He referred to you as a complication. A pause. He referred to your wife as a mistake he didn't catch in time. Something went through me at that. Not heat, not anger in the conventional sense, but a cold and clarifying thing, the way very cold water clarifies everything it touches. He underestimated her, I said. He underestimated both of you, Tommy said quietly. At 8:22, a message came through from Sarah on the secure line, separate from the call running on the same application. I glanced at it, while Tommy was describing the technical architecture of the shell company network. Heads up! Julian made contact with Officer Wade Sims 40 minutes ago. Sims is currently under internal affairs, monitoring. We've had eyes on him since last week, based on irregular financial activity in his personal accounts. The contact was brief. Location of meeting, so do. Industrial Area Warehouse District off 4th Avenue South. Time given to Sims tomorrow night, 9 p.m. Julian believes he is arranging a private meeting with you through Sims as intermediary. I read the message twice. Then I type back, how does Julian think Sims can deliver me? The response came in under a minute. Julian told Sims you contacted the precinct this afternoon, looking to turn yourself in, quietly off the record. Sims was supposed to be the sympathetic officer who handles it discreetly. Julian will be at the warehouse. He thinks he's walking into a private arrangement. He is not. I set the phone face down on the bedspread for a moment. Tommy was still talking on the screen. Something about the Nevada incorporation dates of 3 specific shell entities, precise and thorough, the kind of detail that prosecutors require and that juries need translated. I picked the phone back up and focused on his face. Tommy, I said when he reached a pause. When this is over, when it's all in front of a court, and the people who need to answer for it are answering for it, I want you to know that what you did took more courage than you're giving yourself credit for. His expression shifted, not quite breaking, but moving in that direction, the way a face moves when it receives something it wasn't braced for. I just copied a drive, he said. You copied the truth, I said. There's a difference. After the call ended, I sat in the dark of room 14 at the Cascade Rest Motel, with the broken light in the parking lot, casting an orange stripe across the ceiling through the gap in the curtains. Tomorrow night. A warehouse in Sodo. Julian walking into something he thought he had arranged. I thought about what Sarah had written. He thinks he's walking into a private arrangement. I thought about Elias Morrow's brake line cut precisely enough to fail gradually. And I thought Julian has spent his entire life believing he is the one who sets the terms. Tomorrow someone else would be setting them. I didn't sleep until past 2 in the morning, and when I did, it was the kind of sleep that doesn't restore anything shallow, punctuated by half-formed dreams that dissolved the moment I reached for them. At 5:45 a.m. I gave up entirely and sat at the small desk by the window, with the curtains open, watching the Aurora Avenue traffic move through the dark in slow, headlit streams. There is something specific about watching a city move at that hour when you are not part of its movement. Everyone in those cars had somewhere to go, a shift starting a flight to catch a life continuing in its ordinary direction. I had a motel room and a burner phone and a decision to make that I had been circling since the previous evening without landing on it. The decision was not whether to cooperate with the FBI. That had been settled in my mind since Sarah laid out the plan the night before. The decision was something harder and more personal than that. It was whether I was willing to be in the same room as Julian, whether I could sit across from my son and allow him to believe for however long the operation required that he had cornered me, whether I could hold myself together long enough for the recording equipment to capture what it needed before the walls came down. Marcus arrived at 7:15 with Rex and 2 cups of coffee from a diner 3 blocks south. He knocked twice quietly, and when I opened the door, he handed me a cup without ceremony and looked at my face with the particular attention of a man assessing structural integrity. You didn't sleep, he said. And not much, I said. He came inside and sat in the chair I had vacated by the window. Rex settled at his feet. The room felt less hollow with them in it, which was something. I've been thinking about what Tommy said, I told Marcus, wrapping both hands around the coffee cup. About Julian calling Helen a mistake he didn't catch in time. I looked at the surface of the coffee. She was 49 years old when she sat down with that attorney and built the trust mechanism. She had just been diagnosed. She knew what the prognosis was. I stopped for a moment, steadied myself, and continued. She was dying, Marcus. And instead of spending that energy on fear or anger or grief, she spent it building something that would protect me from a threat she couldn't name out loud. And she never told me because she didn't want me to know that she thought our son was capable of this. Marcus let me finish. He didn't move to fill the space with reassurance. That she knew, I said. She had known for a long time. That some people see clearly, Marcus said, and choose to carry it alone because the alternative is making the people they love carry it too. He looked out the window at the brightening street. Brooke's mother was like that. Saw things early and said nothing because she thought silence was protection. A pause. It isn't always, but it comes from love. That part is always true. Sarah arrived at 9 a.m. with Agent Cole Whitfield. I had not met Whitfield before. He was 45, lean and precise, in the way of someone who has spent decades in rooms where precision was not optional. He wore a plain charcoal suit, and he shook my hand with the brief, firm grip of a man who had long since stopped performing warmth for strangers and had decided efficiency was its own form of respect. "Mr. Vance," he said, "I want to walk you through what tonight involves and what we need from you. Before I do that, I need you to review and sign a proffer agreement. A proffer agreement, known in federal practice as a Queen for a Day letter, is a document that establishes the terms under which a cooperating witness can speak freely with prosecutors and investigators without their statements being used directly against them in court. It protects the witness while providing law enforcement with information they need to build the larger case. My attorney, a calm and thorough woman named Diane Farrell, whom Sarah had referred me to the previous afternoon, had reviewed the document by phone that morning and cleared it. I read it carefully, then I signed it. Whitfield set the agreement aside and laid a simple map on the desk, a warehouse floor plan in Sodo, south of the Stadium District. He walked me through it with the detachment of someone describing a logistical puzzle rather than a dangerous operation. Entry points, recording equipment placement, the two-way mirror set up behind the eastern partition wall, the positions of 4 FBI agents and 2 SPD officers who would be present but invisible until the moment Whitfield gave the signal. "Your role," Whitfield said, "is to receive Julian, to allow him to speak, to respond naturally without leading him, or making promises you are not authorized to make. The moment he makes a direct admission, either verbal or behavioral, I give the signal, and we move." He looked at me steadily. "You are not in danger. He will not know you are wired until it is too late for that information to be useful to him." "He'll bring something," I said. "Julian doesn't walk into a room without a contingency." Whitfield nodded once. "We're aware of that. The room has been swept and controlled since 6 this morning. Nothing enters that space that we haven't cleared." After Whitfield stepped outside to take a call, Sarah sat on the edge of the desk and looked at me with the directness that I had come to understand was simply how she communicated when she thought something mattered. "Arthur," she said, "you don't have to be in that room. We have enough for federal charges without your presence tonight. The USB Tommy's server, copy the FinCEN report, the tie clip Elias's death. Julian is already surrounded by evidence he doesn't know exists." She paused. "But if he walks into that warehouse and you were there, he will say things he would never say to an agent or an attorney. He will say them to you because you are his father, and because he believes at his core that he has already won." I thought about Julian at 7 years old, sitting on the back steps of the Burien house on a summer evening, showing me a frog he had found in the garden, with the complete and guileless delight of a child who has not yet learned to perform anything. I had sat beside him on those steps, and we had looked at the frog together, and he had said in complete seriousness, "Dad, do you think it knows it's a frog?" I had loved him so much in that moment, I couldn't speak. "I'll be there," I said. Before I reveal what happened when Arthur and Julian finally came face to face, comment the word "waiting" below. Because what Julian did next in that room is something I still find difficult to say out loud. One more note: this story includes fictional elements woven in for depth and educational value. If you'd prefer not to continue, you're welcome to step away here, but for those staying, what's coming next will make everything that came before make sense. They brought me to the warehouse at 6:15 in the evening. It was a low, wide building on a side street off 4th Avenue South in the SoDo district, the part of Seattle that exists between the sports stadiums and the industrial waterfront, where the streets are wide enough for freight trucks, and the buildings don't have names, only addresses. From the outside, it looked like every other commercial storage facility in the neighborhood: corrugated metal siding, a roll-up loading door, a single bulb above the entrance that cast a yellow circle on the wet asphalt. Nothing about it suggested that 8 federal and city law enforcement personnel had been inside since 6 that morning, preparing a room. Whitfield met me at the side entrance with 2 agents whose names I was not given. They walked me through a narrow corridor past a row of metal shelving units and into a central room roughly 30 feet square, concrete floor, a folding table, and 2 chairs positioned under a single overhead work light. On the eastern wall, a portable partition had been erected, floor-to-ceiling matte gray, designed to look like a temporary divider of the kind that warehouses use to section off inventory areas. Behind it, invisible from the main room, was the observation setup 4 monitors, displaying feeds from 6 concealed cameras, a digital recording system, and seating for Whitfield, Sarah, and 2 additional agents. A technical specialist, a young woman in a fleece jacket who moved with the quick efficiency of someone for whom this kind of setup was entirely routine, wired me in the side corridor. A small transmitter, no larger than a shirt button, was affixed to the inner lining of my jacket collar. A secondary recorder backup to the room's primary system was clipped to my belt under my shirt. She checked both devices twice, had me count to 10, allowed to test the audio levels, and then looked at me with the matter-of-fact expression of someone who has done this 100 times. "You're good," she said. "Just talk normally. Don't project. The room picks up everything." I nodded. Whitfield appeared at my shoulder. "One thing to remember," he said. "You are not conducting an interrogation. You are having a conversation. Let him lead. Let him say what he came to say. If he offers you something, money, a deal, a threat, receive it. Don't negotiate. Don't refuse dramatically. Just let it land on the record." He looked at me steadily. "Can you do that?" "Yes," I said. What I did not say was that I had no idea whether I actually could, and that the gap between those 2 answers was the thing I had been living in for the past 20 hours. Why, at 7 p.m., Officer Wade Sims made the call. Sims was 35, with the softened posture of a man who had been making small compromises for long enough that they no longer felt like compromises. He was sitting in an unmarked car 2 blocks from the warehouse under direct observation from an internal affairs unit that had been monitoring his communications for the past week. The call to Julian was brief, 41 seconds recorded in full. "It's arranged," Sims said. "He's there. He came in quietly like you wanted. No attorney, no backup. He wants to resolve this without it going further." A pause while Julian spoke. 9 o'clock, the address I sent you. Another pause. "The 50, I need it before I walk away from this. We agreed." Julian's response was 4 words: "It's already been sent." Sims checked his phone. The transfer had arrived, $50,000, routed through an encrypted wire transfer linked to a shell account that the FBI's financial forensics team had been tracking since the previous afternoon. The moment Sims confirmed receipt, the transfer became documented evidence of bribery of a law enforcement officer, a federal offense under 18 U.S. Code, Section 201, carrying a penalty of up to 15 years. Sims sat in the car. He had been told by Internal Affairs that his cooperation from this point forward would be considered in any charging decisions made against him. He had been told this in the flat, careful language that law enforcement uses when it wants a person to understand their situation precisely without making promises it cannot keep. Sims had listened and then said nothing for a long moment, and then said he understood. At 8:35, a black SUV was picked up by a traffic camera on 4th Avenue South, moving south toward the warehouse district. Sarah sent a message to the burner phone. "He's 2 minutes out, single vehicle, appears to be driving himself, no visible passengers." I was sitting at the folding table in the center of the room. The overhead light was the only light source, which meant everything beyond its reach was in deep shadow. The shelving units along the walls, the corners of the room, the partition behind which 8 people were waiting, without making a sound. The concrete floor was cold enough that I could feel it through the soles of my shoes. I had Helen's photograph in my jacket pocket, not for sentiment, or not only for sentiment. I had put it there in the morning when Marcus dropped me at the FBI field office for the final briefing, and I had kept my hand against it through the drive to Sodo and the wiring process and the waiting. And it had done what I needed it to do, which was to remind me of exactly what I was sitting in this chair for. The exterior door at the far end of the corridor opened at 8:58 p.m. Footsteps on concrete, measured unhurried the walk of a man who believes he has already decided how this ends. Then Julian stepped through the doorway into the light. He looked exactly like himself. That was the thing I had not been prepared for. Not some altered version, not the villain of a story. Just my son, 32 years old, in a dark coat, his face composed and unreadable, the way it had been composed and unreadable on the television screen 2 mornings ago. He scanned the room in a single sweep, cataloged everything in it, including me, and then he did something I had not expected. He smiled. "A's dad," he said. "I'm glad you called." He sat down across from me without being invited. That was Julian. He had never waited for permission to occupy a space. As a child, it had seemed like confidence. Sitting across from him in a warehouse in Sodo, with 8 people behind a wall and a recorder against my ribs, it looked like something else entirely. He set a small paper bag on the table between us, the kind that coffee shops use for pastries. He smoothed the top of it with 2 fingers, a precise, unhurried gesture, and then folded his hands on the table and looked at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before, something between satisfaction and relief, the look of a man who has been waiting a long time to arrive at a particular moment. "I brought you something," he said. "You haven't eaten properly in 2 days. I know how you get." I looked at the bag. I did not touch it. "Sit with me for a minute first," I said. "I haven't seen you in 8 months. Something flickered across his face, recalibration so fast it was almost invisible. "Of course," he said. I kept my voice even. "How did you know I hadn't eaten?" "I've had someone keeping an eye on things," he said. "Making sure you were all right, under the circumstances. The circumstances being that my house burned down." "Yes." He held my gaze without flinching. "That was unfortunate." Unfortunate. The words sat on the table between us like something he had dropped there deliberately, not a mistake, a test watching to see how I responded to the precise degree of distance he was maintaining. "Hey, Julian," I said, "why did you come here tonight?" He tilted his head slightly. "You asked me to." "Sims told you I asked. That's different." A pause. Something shifted in his posture, not much, a degree or two. The adjustment of a man who has realized the room is not quite the room he expected. He looked at me for a long moment, and then he made a decision I could see move through him like a current. "You want the honest version," he said. "I want to understand," I said. "That's all. I want to understand how we got here." He exhaled slowly. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped not to a whisper, but to the register of a man who has taken off a layer he had been wearing for a long time and discovered it was heavier than he realized. "Yeah, Mom built that trust to trap me," he said. "You know that. She knew what I was doing, and she built a mechanism to report it the moment I moved the money. She didn't confront me. She didn't warn me. She just built a cage and put it where I'd walk into it." His jaw tightened. "Do you know what it's like to realize your own mother considered you a threat to be managed rather than a son to be talked to?" My hands were flat on the table. "She loved you," I said. "She built that trust because she loved your father, and she was trying to protect him." "She chose you," Julian said. "There was no heat in it. That was what made it terrible, the complete absence of heat, as though the wound had been there so long it had gone past feeling. Every time, every decision, the house, the fun, the trust, all of it arranged around protecting you. I was peripheral. I was a variable to be managed." He looked at me directly. "I built something worth $400 million. I built it from nothing, from a business degree and 14-hour days and decisions that would have made you sick to know about. And not once, not one time did you look at what I had built and say that you were proud of me." The air in the room felt very thin. "I am your father," I said, and my voice broke on the last word, cracked cleanly through the middle, and I let it because it was true and because some things deserve to be said in a broken voice. "And I am telling you right now that I would have given every dollar in that trust fund and the house and everything else to have not been sitting in this warehouse tonight. I would have given all of it to have had you call me instead." Something moved across Julian's face, pain, real pain, the first unmanaged thing I had seen from him since he walked through the door. It lasted approximately 2 seconds. Then it was gone. He reached across the table and pushed the paper bag toward me. "Drink the coffee," he said. "It'll get cold." I looked at the bag. I looked at his face. "What's in it, Julian?" A long pause. "Something to make this easier," he said. "For both of us? You disappear quietly. The investigation loses its central witness. I handle the rest." His voice was completely steady. "It won't hurt. I made sure of that." The room was completely silent for 3 full seconds. Then Whitfield's voice came through a speaker mounted above the partition. "Julian Vance, this is Special Agent Cole Whitfield of the FBI Seattle Field Office. You are under arrest." The eastern partition dropped. Not dramatically, it simply folded back on its hinges in a single smooth motion, revealing the observation room beyond it, fully lit with 4 monitors and 4 agents, and Sarah Jenkins standing with her arms at her sides and her expression set to the particular flatness of a person who has been waiting a long time for something and feels no satisfaction now that it has arrived, only the weight of what comes next. Julian turned and looked at the room. He turned back and looked at me. His face was for the first time in my life completely unreadable, not composed, not performing, simply blank, like a screen that has lost its signal. 2 agents had him on his feet and cuffed before he said another word. They walked him toward the side corridor, and I watched him go, and just before he passed through the doorway, he turned his head and looked at me over his shoulder, not with anger, not with fear, with something that looked for just a moment like the face of the boy who had sat on the back steps in summer and asked me whether the frog knew it was a frog. Then he was through the door and gone. Sarah crossed the room and stood across the table from me. She looked at the paper bag. "Dr. Wills is outside," she said. "She'll test the contents." Her voice was quiet. "Are you all right?" My eyes were burning. My hands were shaking for the first time in 2 days, really shaking. The kind that comes when the body finally releases something it has been holding at great cost. "No," I said honestly, "but I will be. The federal courthouse on Stewart Street in downtown Seattle is a building that takes itself seriously. All granite and symmetry, the kind of architecture that was designed to make the people standing inside it feel the weight of what happens there." On the morning of December 9th, 2025, I stood on the sidewalk outside it for a long moment before I went in, looking up at the facade in the gray winter light, and I thought about how strange it was that the resolution of something so personal was going to happen in a building so deliberately impersonal. Marcus was beside me. He had been beside me in one way or another for the past 26 days. "Ready," he said. "Ask me again in an hour," I said. He almost smiled. We stood there a moment longer than was strictly necessary. The December air was cold, and still the kind of cold that doesn't move against you, but simply surrounds you until you stop noticing it. A few other people moved past us up the steps. Attorneys with rolling briefcases, a young woman in a gray coat, talking quietly into her phone, a court officer who held the door without looking at us. None of them knew what was about to happen inside. None of them would have had any particular reason to care. I thought about the night of November 12th, 26 days ago, the invoices on the desk at Pacific Rim Logistics, the clock on the wall ticking, the phone lighting up with a name I hadn't expected. Everything that had followed from that single moment, the break room, the parking lot, the old Ford, the coffee shop, the warehouse felt. Standing here in the December cold, like a country I had traveled through rather than a sequence of days I had lived. I had not slept in my own house in nearly 4 weeks. The house itself was still a construction site, cedar framing and plastic sheeting where the eastern wall had been. I had been living out of a bag at Marcus's place since the 2nd week of November, sleeping in the spare room that smelled of old books and Rex's presence eating whatever Marcus put in front of me without much attention to what it was. None of that mattered this morning. "Yet let's go in," I said. Marcus picked up Rex's leash. Rex was waiting at a post down the block under the supervision of a young FBI paralegal named Dan, who had drawn what was clearly the least desirable assignment of the morning, and we went up the steps together. The case against Julian had moved with the particular velocity that federal cases acquire when the evidence is both overwhelming and well organized. Agent Whitfield's team had filed the initial criminal complaint within 48 hours of Julian's arrest, covering charges of wire fraud, money laundering, obstruction of justice, bribery of a public official, and attempted poisoning, the last charge classified under Washington state law as first-degree assault with intent to cause substantial bodily harm, prosecuted in conjunction with the federal charges, given the context of a federal investigation. The attempted poisoning charge had been confirmed when Dr. Nora Wills, working with the FBI's forensic chemistry unit, identified the substance in the paper bag Julian had brought to the warehouse. Dr. Wills was 58, my family physician for the past 14 years, a precise, careful woman who had delivered difficult news to her patients with the same steady compassion she brought to everything else. She had appeared before the grand jury in late November and testified that the substance recovered from the paper bag was a concentrated solution of a sedative compound in a dosage calculated to cause acute respiratory depression in a male of my age and weight. The determination of lethality she had stated was probable rather than certain, but the intent given the dosage was consistent with causing death or serious incapacitation rather than merely sedation. Julian had not prepared a cup of coffee for his father. He had prepared a calculation. I had read Dr. Wills's grand jury testimony in a document Whitfield had shared with me during one of our weekly briefings, sitting at the small kitchen table in Marcus's house with a cup of tea going cold at my elbow. I had read it twice carefully, the way I used to read contracts at Pacific Rim, looking for the precise language, the specific weight of each word. When I reached the phrase consistent with causing death, I had set the document down on the table and looked out the window at Marcus's backyard for a long time, without moving. Not from shock. The shock had worn away by then, replaced by something more structural, a rearrangement of my understanding of my own life, a recalibration so fundamental that I sometimes felt it not as emotion, but as simple physical fact, the way you feel the ground shift in a small earthquake and know without drama that something has changed. The grand jury returned a true bill, a formal indictment on November 28th. Julian had entered a not guilty plea at his arraignment, which was standard procedure and surprised no one. His legal team, a firm out of Bellevue with a reputation for defending white-collar defendants, filed a series of pre-trial motions to suppress evidence that were denied by the presiding judge in succession over the following week. That judge was Patricia Hahn. Judge Hahn was 62, with close-cropped silver hair and a reputation on the federal bench for running a courtroom, with the efficient authority of someone who had seen every procedural maneuver available and was not impressed by any of them. She had reviewed the evidence package, the USB from Victor Tommy's server copy, the FinCEN report triggered by Helen's trust mechanism, the tie clipped the recorded warehouse conversation and the bribery transfer to Sims, and had denied all suppression motions in a written ruling that was by the standards of federal judicial prose unusually direct. Whitfield had forwarded me a copy. He had written in the accompanying email, "Only Judge Hahn does not waste words." On December 8th, facing the full weight of the evidence and the recorded confession from the warehouse, Julian's legal team had entered into plea negotiations with the federal prosecutor's office. The negotiation had taken 11 hours. I knew this because Sarah had called me at 11:40 p.m. to tell me an agreement had been reached, and I had been sitting awake in Marcus's spare room, unable to sleep, watching the streetlight move through the curtains and the wind. Julian pled guilty on the morning of December 9th to 3 counts wire fraud, money laundering in excess of $1 million and bribery of a public official. The attempted poisoning charge was incorporated into the sentencing guidelines as an aggravating factor rather than a separate plea, which the prosecutor's office accepted in exchange for Julian's full cooperation with the ongoing investigation into Meridian Capital Group's broader network. Officer Wade Sims had already pled guilty separately to 1 count of accepting a bribe and was cooperating fully. I sat in the gallery and watched Julian stand before Judge Hahn and confirm his plea for each count. He looked smaller than he did in my memory, which I understood was not a physical reality, but a perceptual one, the way people shrink when the architecture they have built around themselves collapses, and you see them standing in the open without it. His attorney stood to his left. A federal marshal stood to his right. He wore a dark suit and his posture was correct, controlled the last performance of a man whose entire adult life had been one long performance. He did not look at me. I had expected that he might one last glance across the gallery, some final communication across the distance we had arrived at. He kept his eyes on the bench throughout, and his voice when he spoke was composed and flat, the performance of composure rather than the thing itself. Each time Judge Hahn asked him to confirm his plea, he said guilty in the same register, not broken, not defiant. Simply stated, the way you state a fact, you have decided to stop fighting. Judge Hahn sentenced him to 14 years in federal prison, with eligibility for supervised release after serving 85% of the sentence under federal guidelines. 14 years. I sat with that number and turned it over the way you turn over a stone to see what is underneath it. I had expected to feel something clarifying relief, perhaps, or a version of justice that felt earned and complete. What I found instead was mostly exhaustion, the deep structural exhaustion of a person who has been holding an enormous weight for a very long time and has finally been allowed to set it down. Not satisfaction, not closure, which is a word I have always found suspect, as if grief and damage were rooms you could leave and lock behind you. Just the particular quiet of a thing that has been decided and cannot be undecided. I was still sitting in the gallery when Marcus put his hand briefly on my shoulder, one firm, wordless touch, and then stood to leave. I followed him out. After the proceeding ended and the gallery began to empty around us, I was standing in the corridor outside the courtroom when I heard Marcus say a name behind me. Brooke? I turned. She was standing at the end of the corridor near the elevator bank, 28 years old, with her father's gray eyes and a composure that looked like it had been built carefully over time rather than come naturally. She was wearing a dark coat and carrying a small bag, and she looked above everything else like a person who had decided to show up somewhere that cost her something and had shown up anyway. She had driven up from Portland the previous evening. Marcus had told me that. Morning she had called him at 9 p.m. and said she needed to be there, and he had said nothing except, "I'll leave the key under the mat," and hung up. Marcus crossed the corridor in 4 steps and put his arms around her, and she pressed her face against his shoulder, and neither of them said anything for a long moment. And I am not going to apologize for the fact that I had to look away, because some things are too private to witness fully, even when you are standing 10 feet from them. I looked at the tall windows at the end of the hall, at the gray December sky beyond them, and I let them have that moment without my eyes on it. When I looked back, Brooke was looking at me over her father's shoulder. Her eyes were wet, but her expression was steady, the steadiness of someone who has practiced holding themselves together and has gotten through necessity very good at it. "Mr. Vance," she said, "I'm sorry about your house. I'm sorry about all of it." My throat was tight. "None of this was your fault," I said. "You did the right thing when it was the hardest thing to do. Everything that happened after all of it traces back to you being willing to do that. Not to Julian, not to Elias Morrow, to you walking into your supervisor's office with what you had found and refusing to pretend you hadn't found it." She held my gaze for a moment, long enough for me to see that the words had landed where I meant them to. Then she nodded once small, firm the nod of someone receiving something they needed to hear and choosing to keep it. The corridor was emptying around us. Outside the tall windows at the end of the hall, Seattle was doing what Seattle does in December. Gray sky, steady rain, the city continuing its business with complete indifference to the things being resolved inside its buildings. I thought about Helen. I thought about a trust document and a chamomile tea, and a woman who had looked at the future clearly enough to build something that would outlast her, who had sat in an attorney's office while she was dying and constructed a legal mechanism precise enough to fire 2 years after her death, and accurate enough to do exactly what she had designed it to do. She had been right about all of it. April comes late to Seattle, and I have always found that appropriate. The house on Southwest 152nd Street had been rebuilt over the winter, same foundation, same 2-story profile, but new cedar floors and larger east-facing windows that let in a quality of morning light the old house never had. Helen would have liked that. She had always said the kitchen was too dark. I moved back in on the 1st of March. The first night I lay awake listening to the new lumber settle around me, and I felt for the first time in months that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. On a Saturday morning in the 2nd week of April, I walked next door. Marcus was already on his porch. He was sitting in the weathered Adirondack chair that had survived more winters than either of us cared to calculate, and Rex was at his feet slower now, his muzzle noticeably grayer than it had been that November morning in the Pacific Rim Logistics parking lot, but present in the quiet, unhurried way that old dogs manage. He raised his head when I came up the steps. His tail moved twice. I considered that a greeting. Marcus handed me a cup before I even sat down. Strong and black, no ceremony. Across the street, Greta Simmons was working her garden with the focused attention she brought to anything worth doing. She raised one hand in a wave without turning around, the gesture of a neighbor who had moved well past formality into something more enduring. "Brooke called yesterday," Marcus said. "How is she?" "Better." He turned the cup in his hands. "She's consulting for a nonprofit in Portland now. Financial literacy work, helping ordinary people read investment documents before they sign them." He paused. She wants to use Meridian as a case study. I thought about the young woman I had met in the courthouse corridor in December, the quiet steadiness in her eyes after everything she had been through. Fired, blacklisted, personnel file falsified, 2 years of her life dismantled by a man who thought she was a loose thread to be cut. "She'll be good at it," I said. "She will," Marcus agreed. We sat without speaking after that, and it was different from silence. Silence is the absence of something. What Marcus and I had developed over these months was a companionship that no longer needed filling two men who had already said the things that mattered and had become comfortable with everything that remained. I thought about Julian. Not with anger. The anger had burned itself out somewhere between November and February slowly and without announcement, leaving behind something quieter and more permanent, a settled sorrow that had found its proper place inside me and no longer demanded to be resolved. He was in the federal system now. 14 years. Whether he would do the honest work of that time was not mine to decide. I had said what I needed to say to him in a warehouse in Sodo. It was on the record. It was true. I had also said it to a man who for one unguarded moment in that room had looked at me the way he used to at 7 years old, uncertain, wanting to be told he hadn't gone too far. That moment cost me more than the trial, but I held it carefully. It was still mine. In my jacket pocket was a photograph. Marcus and I at Pike Place Market 3 weeks earlier, standing in front of the flower stalls with coffee cups in hand. Brooke had taken it on her first visit to Seattle since the sentencing and handed it to me without explanation. "You should have this," she said. I didn't ask why. I understood. "Though, Marcus," I said. That first call, November, when you told me not to go home." I looked at him. "Did you know what it would ask of me?" He considered the question the way he considered everything carefully, without rushing. "I knew it would be complicated," he said. "I didn't know you'd be the steadiest person in the room." "I was frightened the entire time," I said. "I know," Marcus said. "That's what I mean." Rex rested his chin on my shoe. I left it there and did not move. Across the street, Greta stood up and shook her head at the two of us with the affectionate exasperation of a woman who had decided that two aging men on a porch was something she could tolerate indefinitely. I held my cup with both hands and looked at the cherry trees along the street blossoms, holding against the April sky patient and briefly perfect the way beautiful things tend to be. I thought about Helen, about a kitchen she always said was too dark, about chamomile tea at a table late at night, about a woman who had seen clearly enough to build something that would survive her. A dead man's switch, a trust account, a trap so precisely designed that it had fired without any of us touching it. She had loved me quietly and completely, and she had never once made a fuss about it. She had been right about all of it. And on a morning like this one, with strong black coffee and an old dog and a man who had reached for his phone on a November night and changed the direction of everything I understood, finally and without reservation, that family is not always the people who share your name. Sometimes it is the neighbor who picks up the phone at 11 o'clock on a Wednesday and says, "Don't go home. Trust me on this one." People ask what I learned from all of this. The truth is, simple family betrayal doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it wears a good coat, stands in front of a camera, and calls itself grief. This is a family story, and like all real ones, it doesn't end with justice alone. It ends on a porch with cold coffee and someone who chose to show up when blood didn't. I am not a perfect man. I missed things I should have seen. So, let me say this. Plainly, don't be like me. Don't wait for the fire to ask the questions that matter. Look carefully at the hands that pour your coffee. I'm not a deeply religious man, but I believe God places certain people in our path at exactly the moment we need them most. Marcus was mine. My personal opinion. The most dangerous family betrayal is the one you never saw coming from someone sitting at your own table. If this family story stayed with you, leave a comment telling me which moment hit you hardest. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't already subscribed, the next story is waiting. Thank you for staying until the very end. It means more than you know. Note, some stories on this channel include fictional elements built for educational purposes. If that's not for you, no hard feelings. Choose what serves you best. But if you're staying, I'll see you in the next one.